It's just a phase. You bring this all on yourself. Just relax already. What's wrong with me? Well, maybe there's nothing wrong with me, and they're just not seeing what I'm seeing. Have you heard these phrases before? I know I have. I've been dealing with high-functioning anxiety and depression since I started high school, and I know I'm not alone. Despite how progressively social 2016 may be, much of what I just described to you is still the cultural norm. And that's troubling, and that's why it's time for me to put society on blast. Society should view mental health, just as it would physical health, as an integral and inclusive part of wellness. That is why today I want you to understand that mental disorders are medical conditions and that the problem is with how we view it. Primarily, mental disorders are medical conditions. The mental processes involved in these mental disorders are what makes it as real as the common cold. In a 2012 article in Monitor on Psychology, Kristen Weir states that all mental processes are brain processes, and therefore all disorders of mental functioning are biological diseases. And they have behavioral components as well as biological components. The only difference here is that the organ of interest is the brain, not the heart or the pancreas. The biological components at work here are the neurotransmitters. They are what carry messages from nerve to nerve in the brain. And when we have too much or too little of a certain neurotransmitter, it's what can cause the mental disorder. For instance, the brain chemistry affects how we interact with our outer world, and our outer world can affect how we deal with our inner world. My primary care physician once told me that everyone's wired differently. That's why it's important not to blame ourselves or the person for having symptoms of a mental disorder. Just as we wouldn't blame someone who has a cold or the flu for having those symptoms. In that same 2012 article in Monitor on Psychology, Weir goes on to explain, when it comes to mental illness, the one-size-fits-all approach doesn't apply here. There may be more than one cause to this mental disorder or disorders. That leads me to the root of the problem, and that is how we view it. Our extrinsic forces are what's leading us to believe about mental disorders. Society learns to oversimplify. In a 2014 article titled "The Impact of Mental Illness Stigma on Seeking and Participating in Mental Health Care," they say Corrigan, Druss, and Perlich say examples of this are cultural norms and perceptions determining social indicators of mental illness, thereby impacting stigmatizing cues. And what's really at stake here is a person's well-being. The stigma deters those who need help from getting it. Corrigan, Druss, and Perlich go on in that 2014 article in Psychological Science in the Public Interest that stigma becomes a particular problem when it undermines the seeking out and participating in services demonstrated effectiveness in reducing dysfunction and disability and promoting recovery. And when we apply this to us as college students, what we do now affects how we deal with things in the future. In a 2016 article in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, Chan, Ferrier, Gulliver, Bennett, Griffiths, and Kathleen state that the negative outcomes associated with untreated mental disorders in college students includes poor interpersonal relationships, lower engagement in campus activities, and increased risk of educational dropout. Regarding that last point, the risk of educational dropout, when we can't deal with life and what it throws at us, and we drop out of school, the money problem is still there. It doesn't just leave, and that creates other problems. And that's why it's important to know that it doesn't just affect college students. It affects everybody, because mental disorders do not discriminate. You'd be surprised who's fighting one. Not only does it look like the person who can't get out of bed in the morning, but it's also the person who works really hard, has many jobs, gets the promotions, and earns that 4.0 GPA. And the key here is empathy. Just because you don't know of it or experienced it personally doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or isn't important. In conclusion, I stand firm that society should view mental health just as it would physical health, as an integrally inclusive part of wellness. And that's why it's important to reiterate our main points today. Mental disorders are medical conditions, and they have biological components as well as behavioral components. And the problem, and this is what's most important, is how we view it. Society is the student and the teacher. So, my hope for you today is not that we make excuses for blatant disregard to rules, but that we understand that we're all wired differently to interact with our environments. And those closest to us should help us grow through it, not throw us through it. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.